How does English orthography compare to other orthographies?
So English is sort of remarkable in its structure in that I think it's the deepest orthographic depth of any language that's been thought of by humans. Yeah, because they might be out there. What I would say, and also then when you compare that to what we mean by that essentially is that there are multiple ways with which we can represent the sounds of speech to correctly write words. Contrast that with some other languages such as Finnish, which has the shallowest orthography because they have pretty much a one-to-one ratio in terms of the abstract squiggly symbols that they use that represent particular sounds. I think what's also quite interesting as well is that, as well as it having kind of a deep orthographic depth, it also has quite a complex syllabic structure with it as well. There's a nice little paper by Seymour and Erskine, who kind of quite nicely put this into a nice little table where you can kind of see how English compares to other European languages, which kind of definitely shows English being the most the deepest of orthographic depth, and also kind of the most complex in terms of its syllabic structure. So yeah, straight away, and it's quite a useful thing to know, I think, because quite often you hear people, whether they be people within education or people outside of education, who go, oh, but in Finland they come to school at the age of 7, and they learn to read English and they learn to read Finnish, which undoubtedly is true. But what's important to kind of note is that because that system is so simple in the Finnish language, is that by the age of 7 they pretty much come to school already being able to read their own language, because it is not as complex as English. And so that's why it's quite a good rebuttal for that kind of idea as to why children should perhaps start school later in England, because actually it takes that much more longer to understand and learn our kind of the structures of spelling that we have within English.
So if I may, I'll try and put the sensible, really good stuff that Neil's described there into maybe a slightly wider context. So generally, I mean, there are lots of ways to represent spoken language, and the common types are generally kind of the way that they're most commonly divided up is into like logographic, syllabic, and alphabetic. And effectively, logographic language, written languages, or should I say, logographic orthographies, are orthographies where at the heart of the writing system, the individual words or morphemes, which are kind of chunks of meaning, that they're represented by symbols. That's a logographic orthography. Now, there are no purely logographic orthographies. People think Chinese, for example, is. It isn't. It also represents sounds, but it certainly involves logographs, single symbols that represent words or morphemes, these chunks of meaning. So that there are also syllabic orthographies. Now, those, the kind of the chunk of sound that they are representing in the writing system is the syllable. So, for example, the Japanese orthography represents syllables using symbols called kana, which are divided into, I think, hiragana and katakana, but effectively they're called kana. But these symbols represent syllables. And it's a great idea because there are roughly 100 spoken syllables in Japanese. Going back to what Neil said, though, when we come to something like English, we require this third kind, what's known as like an alphabetic orthography, an orthography that doesn't represent or doesn't have symbols that represent morphemes or words, doesn't have symbols for the grain size, as it were, of syllables, but instead has symbols that represent phonemes. And this is what makes an alphabetic orthography like English. It's a writing system where the chunk of sound around which that writing system has been built is the smallest chunk of sound that can separate two words, which we call the phoneme. So there are lots of different writing systems. I mean, it's worth noting, somewhere between a syllabic and an alphabetic orthography, there are kind of there's a bit of overlap between those two in orthographies like Hebrew and Arabic, because they have if you represent all the sounds, they have an alphabetic structure, but then they don't always represent all of the sounds, especially for text that's used by fluent readers. But in short, English is this alphabetical orthography. It represents the phonemes, what we can think of as the smallest chunks of sound rather than something larger. And it does that, as Neil says, because of some of the particular complexities of English as an Indo-European language. If we wanted to represent English in a syllabic form, we would need thousands upon thousands of symbols, because there are thousands upon thousands of potential syllables. The writing system has to marry up with the spoken language in some way. So we end up with an alphabetic writing system in which phonemes are being represented by symbols, which we call graphemes, which are the smallest meaningful unit of contrast in a writing system. Just finally, to kind of tie up what Neil said, so he started talking about the depth of orthography, and he's bang on the money that English has a uniquely deep alphabetic orthography, with things like Estonian and Finnish and Italian and Welsh at the other end of the spectrum, and French somewhere in the middle. So we don't have this lovely, neat and tidy one-to-one correspondence between phonemes and graphemes. We've got something much more complex, which, as we'll discuss, has significant impact on how we need to teach this stuff.
When we say Finnish is easier, and then the kids coming able to read, it's not so much for an outsider, though. Is that right? I want to make sure that we cover all bases on arguments that get made when this conversation is happening, because rather you say it now than have to spend your whole weekend tweeting what what the actual.
Yeah, well, the nature of learning to read is you are connecting the symbols on a page to the spoken language that you are acquiring through it. And because the development of spoken language is biologically primary, that's the recognizing the symbols and the connections between those and sound is kind of the initially, at least, the tricky bit. And that tricky bit isn't as tricky in Finnish. But there are no free lunches here. So, like, if we take a language like Slovak, for example, really easy to initially learn to recognize words, because the relationships between letters and sounds are pretty easy to work out. It's close to a one-to-one correspondence. It's got a shallow orthography, but then you've got other complexities in the writing system. So we mentioned earlier this idea of morphemes, these chunks of meaning. That's quite useful in English, because these chunks of meaning can help us work out the meanings of words. That kind of stuff isn't quite so embedded in stuff like Slovak. So learning the meanings is more difficult. And equally, it's much more complex in how verb endings change, and the way that nouns change, and the way that there's gender within the language. So when we talk about English being really complex, it is complex in many ways, but the choke point, almost the point of greatest complexity in English, is that initial learning to recognize words. Those are initial connections between letters and sounds, between graphemes and phonemes. That's where English is like really complex, and that's what we mean by saying it has a uniquely deep orthography. But down the line, there are other difficulties when it comes to learning to read other languages. It's just that first initial word recognition that is particularly challenging in English. And if I may, an example of how that plays out is that in English, for example, in the first few years of pupils learning to recognize words, we identify word reading difficulties by things like accuracy, because like your average reader is still struggling with 20-30% of words that they might come across, even after they've been reading for 2 or 3 years. If you contrast that with a shallow orthography like German, after a year, you are judging reading difficulties almost purely on pace, because every word can be pretty easily decoded once you've learned the basic relationships between letters and sounds. So yeah, it has pretty major implications for learning to read, and it's different between languages.
Cool. I mean, I wasn't necessarily going to keep that in the podcast. I was just going to see if Neil wanted to. But that seems pretty important.
The only thing I'll add, and it's not that important, but it can get cut, is that in terms of logographs, if you want an example of that, the pound sign is a really good example of what a logograph is. That is actually still part of our English writing system. We see that sign, and straight away we know that that sign stands for pound. So Chris's explanation is always, spot on. But if you wanted a worked example, a real worked example of what that actually is, then I'll throw that one into you as well.
Yeah, and even going beyond kind of like mathematical symbols, like the ampersand is a great example of a logograph, because it literally represents a word and a morpheme, because it's a single, a monomorphemic word. It's really, really lovely example.
Yeah, I'm definitely not deleting that, Neil. That's a really good one. Yeah, ampersand used to be and per se and at the end of the alphabet. Is that right?
Possibly. If it is, I've just learned something new.
Yeah, like that.
I think it was an additional letter. It was a letter at one point. And you would
cool.
have X, Y, Z, and per se, and don't ask me why.